Before we dive into today's topic, think of a time you were starving. Suddenly, every food ad felt irresistible, and even a granola bar you usually ignore seemed valuable. That temporary hunger is a perfect real-world example of a motivating operation, and understanding it is essential for the BCBA exam because it explains why a reinforcer works at one moment but not the next. In this segment, we'll break down what motivating operations are and why they matter for behavior change. We'll cover the three types, UMO, CMO, and SMO, and explore how MOs alter both the value of consequences and the frequency of behavior. You'll learn the key distinctions between unconditioned and conditioned MOs, plus the three CMO subtypes, reflexive, transitive, and surrogate. Finally, we'll clarify the critical difference between an MO and a discriminative stimulus, a concept that frequently appears on the exam. Mastering these distinctions will help you design more effective interventions and answer scenario-based questions with confidence. Motivating operations are foundational for the BCBA exam because they explain why a behavior happens at a specific moment, not just how. An MO is an environmental event that has two critical effects. It momentarily alters the reinforcing or punishing value of consequence, and it simultaneously alters the frequency of any behavior that has previously produced the consequence. For example, food deprivation makes food more valuable, value-altering effect, and increases behaviors like opening the fridge or asking for a snack, behavior-altering effect. These effects are temporary and context-dependent. Once you eat, the MO is gone. This is a key distinction from discriminative stimuli. An SD signals that a reinforcer is available, but an MO determines how much that reinforcer is wanted right now. On the exam, you'll need to identify MOs in scenarios and explain how they shift behavior by changing consequence potency, not just by signaling availability. This slide breaks down the three types of motivating operations you must distinguish for the exam. Unconditioned MOs, or UMOs, are biologically hardwired. Think food deprivation, pain, or extreme temperatures. Their value-altering effects require no learning history and are universal across humans and many species. Conditioned MOs, or CMOs, are acquired through pairing with a UMO or another CMO. For example, a token that signals access to food becomes a CMO for food seeking. These are specific to an individual's learning history and are a common exam focus. Surrogate CMOs, or SMOs, are less frequent but appear in complex scenarios. An SMO is a neutral stimulus that mimics another MO's effect simply by being paired with it, like a tone paired with food deprivation that then evokes food seeking. For the BCBA exam, be ready to identify each type in applied examples, especially the difference between a CMO that alters a consequence's value and an SMO that merely mimics an existing MO's function. Motivating operations don't just make you want something more or less. They directly change how often you engage in behavior and how powerful a consequence becomes. On the BCBA exam, you'll need to distinguish between the evocative and abolishing effects on behavior and the reinforcer establishing and reinforcer abolishing effects on consequence value. For example, food deprivation is a motivating operation that has an evocative effect. It increases the frequency of behaviors like opening the fridge that previously produced food. At the same time, it has a reinforcer establishing effect, making food itself more reinforcing. Conversely, after eating a large meal, satiation has an abolishing effect. It decreases behaviors aimed at getting food and a reinforcer abolishing effect, making food less reinforcing. These four effects always occur in pairs. The same MO simultaneously alters both behavior frequency and consequence value. Expect scenario-based questions on the exam where you must identify which effect is being demonstrated. So practice pairing each MO with its dual impact on behavior and reinforcement. Now, let's clarify the key distinctions between unconditioned and conditioned motivating operations, because the BCBA exam will test your ability to differentiate them. An unconditioned MO, or UMO, is innate. No learning history is required. Think of food deprivation. It alters the value of food as a reinforcer and evokes food-seeking behavior universally across species. In contrast, a conditioned MO, or CMO, is acquired through conditioning. For example, a token paired with food becomes a CMO because it only alters the value of token-related consequences after learning. The value-altering effect of a UMO directly changes the value of unconditioned reinforcers or punishers, like water or pain, while a CMO alters the value of conditioned reinforcers or punishers, such as praise or a warning stimulus. Similarly, the behavior-altering effect of a UMO evokes or abates behavior tied to unconditioned consequences, whereas a CMO does so for conditioned consequences. On the exam, you'll need to recognize these origins and effects to correctly identify whether a scenario involves a UMO or CMO. Now, let's break down the 3 subtypes of conditioned motivating operations you will need to distinguish on the BCBA exam. First, the CMOR, or reflexive MO, is a stimulus that acquires its motivating function by being paired with a worsening or improving condition, like a warning light that's been paired with shock. That light now evokes escape behavior because it establishes shock avoidance as a reinforcer. Next, the CMOT, or transitive MO, alters the value of another stimulus due to a learned relation. A locked door makes a key more valuable, so it evokes seeking behavior to obtain that key. Finally, the CMOS, or surrogate MO, is a neutral stimulus that gains its function by being paired with another MO, essentially mimicking its value-altering effect without direct conditioning. For the exam, remember that CMOR typically evokes escape or avoidance. CMOT evokes seeking or acquisition, and CMOS simply copies the effect of a paired MO. Now let's clarify one of the most commonly confused distinctions on the BCBA exam: the difference between a motivating operation and a discriminative stimulus. While both evoke behavior, they do so through entirely different mechanisms. An MO alters the value of a consequence, making a reinforcer more or less potent, whereas an SD signals the availability of that consequence. For example, food deprivation, a UMO, makes food more valuable, increasing the effectiveness of food as a reinforcer. In contrast, a bell, an SD, signals that lever pressing will produce food. The MO changes how much the consequence is wanted. The SD changes how likely the consequence is to occur. On the exam, when you see a question involving deprivation, satiation, pain, or learned cues like warnings, think MO. If the stimulus precedes a specific response reinforcer relation, like a tone before a lever press that delivers food, it's an SD. Mastering this distinction is essential for correctly identifying behavioral functions in test scenarios. Let's walk through the process flow of how motivating operations influence behavior, because this is a high-yield concept for the BCBA exam. An establishing operation, or EO, does 2 things simultaneously. It increases the reinforcing value of a specific consequence, and it evokes the behavior that has historically produced that consequence. For example, food deprivation makes food more valuable and increases the likelihood of food-seeking behavior. In contrast, an abolishing operation, or AO, decreases the reinforcing value of that same consequence and abates the behavior that produced it. Like satiation after a meal reduces both the value of food and the urge to seek it. These are the value-altering and behavior-altering effects, respectively. On the exam, you'll need to identify which MO is at work based on whether a reinforcer becomes more or less potent and whether behavior increases or decreases. Remember, the value-altering effect changes the stimulus's effectiveness as a reinforcer or punisher at that moment, while the behavior-altering effect changes the current frequency of behavior that has been reinforced by that stimulus. Now let's clarify the critical distinction between establishing operations and abolishing operations, because understanding their opposite effects is essential for the BCBA exam. An establishing operation, or EO, makes a reinforcer more potent at that moment and evokes behavior that has previously produced that reinforcer. For example, food deprivation increases the value of food, so you're more likely to engage in behaviors that get you food. In contrast, an abolishing operation, or AO, makes a reinforcer less potent and abates behavior that has produced it. Food satiation after a large meal makes food less valuable, so you're less likely to seek it. Both are types of motivating operations, but they sit on opposite ends of the same dimension. EOs increase behavior, while AOs decrease it. On the exam, EOs are tested more frequently, but AOs are crucial for understanding satiation-based interventions, such as reducing problem behavior by making the maintaining reinforcer less valuable through non-contingent access. On this slide, we explore how motivating operations are applied in real-world ABA settings, a key area for the BCBA exam. Deprivation-based interventions involve controlling access to preferred items, like toys, to increase their value as reinforcers for desired behavior. For example, limiting iPad time makes it a more potent reward for completing homework. Conversely, satiation-based interventions provide non-contingent access to a reinforcer, such as attention, which abolishes its value and reduces problem behavior, a strategy often used to decrease attention-seeking outbursts. The exam also tests your understanding of conditioned motivating operations. A CMO, like a warning light, can signal danger and evoke help-seeking and safety training, while CMOs, such as a missing item, can prompt requesting behavior and skill acquisition, like asking for a needed tool. These examples illustrate how manipulating MOs can effectively change behavior, a concept you must be ready to apply in exam scenarios. On the BCBA exam, you'll often face scenarios that test your ability to distinguish motivating operations in action. For instance, a child deprived of attention for an hour experiences an establishing operation, EO, making attention more valuable and evoking attention-maintained behavior. Conversely, after a full meal, a client is in an abolishing operation, AO, for edibles, reducing their effectiveness as reinforcers during therapy. Pain from a headache is an unconditioned motivating operation, UMO, establishing pain relief as a reinforcer and evoking medication seeking. A teacher's stern look functions as a reflexive conditioned motivating operation, CMO, evoking compliant behavior to avoid a past reprimand. Finally, a broken pencil is a transitive CMO, CMOs, establishing the sharpener as a reinforcer and evoking requests for it. These examples show how MOs alter both the value of consequences and the frequency of behavior, a core distinction for exam questions on motivation and reinforcement. Now, let's clarify the critical distinction between unconditioned and conditioned motivating operations, as this comparison table is a high-yield exam topic. On the left, UMOs like food deprivation, direct pain, or extreme temperatures require no learning history. Their value-altering and behavior-altering effects are innate. For example, hunger makes food more valuable and evokes food-seeking without prior training. On the right, CMOs are acquired through pairing with a UMO or another reinforcer. A token only becomes a CMO after being paired with food access, and a warning light only signals danger after being paired with shock. For the BCBA exam, you'll often see UMOs in basic scenarios testing your grasp of biological states, while CMOs appear in complex scenarios involving learned cues, such as a client responding to a visual schedule because it signals access to a preferred activity. Remember, UMOs are unlearned and universal. CMOs are learned and context-dependent. This distinction frequently appears in questions about motivation and establishing operations. To master motivating operations for the BCBA exam, start by memorizing the 4 effects: evocative and abolishing effects on behavior, and reinforcer establishing and abolishing effects on value, since these are tested directly. A high-yield distinction under task list item B.17 is differentiating an MO from an SD. An MO alters the value of a reinforcer, while an SD signals its availability. You must also identify the 3 conditioned MO subtypes. CMOR is a warning signal, CMOs when a missing item disrupts a chain, and CMOs when an MO is paired with another MO, and practice recognizing them in scenario-based questions. For intervention applications under G.5, think about using deprivation and satiation to incorporate MOs into behavior change procedures, such as limiting access to a preferred item to increase its reinforcing value. Finally, use simple mnemonics to recall terms. EO means establishing and increases effectiveness. AO means abolishing and decreases it. UMO refers to unlearned MOs, and CMO refers to conditioned MOs. As we wrap up, remember that motivating operations are the engine behind behavior. They temporarily alter both the value of a consequence and the likelihood of any behavior that has produced it in the past. You've seen how unconditioned MOs, like deprivation and satiation, are innate, while conditioned MOs are learned through experience, with reflexive, transitive, and surrogate subtypes each shaping behavior in distinct ways. The critical distinction between an MO and an SD is that an MO changes what is reinforcing, while an SD signals when that reinforcement is available. On the exam, you'll need to recognize how establishing operations increase and abolishing operations decrease momentary effectiveness. Master these concepts by practicing with real-world scenarios. Think about how a client's hunger or access to attention shifts their behavior in a session. You've got the foundation now. Keep drilling these distinctions until they're second nature. Your ability to analyze and manipulate MOs is what separates good interventions from great ones. Stay sharp, stay curious, and trust the process. You're building the expertise to change lives.